My name is Krista Demery. I'm the wildlife diversity biologist for the Trans-Pecos, which is essentially all of West Texas. And today I'm going to share with you a presentation that I gave to the Texas Black Bear Alliance a few months ago. It's a little altered. I added some more background for y'all, some more details. So to kick it off, we're going to start with the historic background of black bears in Texas. And then we're going to move into some of the more recent trends and events that have happened in the last couple of years. In 1901, Veron Bailey was conducting his famous biological surveys of Texas when he made several very important observations of black bear in the Trans-Pecos. While exploring the Chisos Mountains of now Big Bend National Park, Veron Bailey noted that black bear were common in the upper canyons and that signs of both old and young bear were frequently seen. He made a similar statement when he traveled north into the Davis Mountains, and he even ventured to say that black bear were holding their own against unusual odds. His exploration of the Guadalupe Mountains came back with a similar report, and he suggested that black bear were common throughout all of West Texas. But what were these unusual odds that Veron Bailey was talking about? Well, apparently black bear tastes really good. Throughout the late 1800s, multiple advertisements and news headlines promoted black bear steaks, Christmas roast, and even ham of the wild black bear. Here on the screen, you can see several examples from the Dallas Daily Herald and the Austin American Statesman, just showing the tastiness of black bear. This trend was similarly reflected in the West during the famous annual bear hunts in the Davis Mountains. In the late 1800s, the Davis Mountain Bear Hunt had become a regional celebration where multiple families and crowds of between 45 to 75 people, including men, women, and children of all ages, would round up the wagons, the hounds, and the saddle horses for a week-long hunting expedition. Now, the stories that come out of these bear hunts show that between 4 and 12 bear could be taken in a single week. One of the hunt participants, Joe Evans, recalls in a publication that as many as 10 bears, a mountain lion or two, and even possibly a Lobo wolf could have been taken during one of these hunting events. I don't know about you, but I think I can agree with Veron Bailey that the bears of West Texas were definitely experiencing some unusual odds.
Hey, Krista.
On one of these annual...
Sorry to interrupt you. You might want to turn your video off. Your audio is stuttering a little bit, and it might improve the bandwidth.
Let me see if I can figure out how to do it.
I just turned it off for you, I think.
Oh, you did? Okay, good. Well, on one of these annual hunts, they actually came up with a very significant scientific discovery. In November of 1899, C.O. Finley and J.Z. Means were separated from the rest of the hunting party when their dogs came across an unusual scent. Now, the dogs were terrified. Most of them were cowering and refusing to track. And of the 35 dogs in the party, only 4 decided to follow the trail to what led them to the only known observation of a grizzly bear in Texas. And that is now known as the Davis Mountains silvertip grizzly. C.O. Finley later described this epic hunt in an article in the Pecos News some 60 years later, titled "Stalking the Unknown," where he relives the hunt. And I would advise this to anybody who's interested in natural history or the history of West Texas. It's a really good read. And it was during his travels in 1901 that Veron Bailey actually visited the house displaying this skull above the door, and he was able to convince the hunters to donate the skull of this giant bear to the Smithsonian to be evaluated and for safekeeping, You can actually read the handwritten letters from the hunting party to the Smithsonian discussing the specimen and asking if they could have it back to show at the Texas State Fair, but the Smithsonian decided the specimen was too important and told them they couldn't have it back. Unfortunately, those unusual odds that Veron was discussing were weighed too heavily against black bear. Following Bailey's surveys, advertisements for bear meat were still found in local papers, and photographs all the way up until the 1930s showing that bear hunts were still a popular sport in West Texas. By 1944, when Big Bend National Park was established, there were virtually no resident bears known in the area. And by 1950, it was widely believed that black bear had been completely extirpated from the Trans-Pecos. In this publication from 1973 discussing the status of black bear in Texas, you can see that we're still having a hunting season with most of the Trans-Pecos operating under an open season from November 1st to December 31st of each year, with a bag limit of 1 black bear per season. Despite these overwhelming conditions, black bear have proven to be a resilient species, and they have actually done what few other extirpated predators could. They have managed to naturally recolonize their native range. From 1940 to 1980, we received scattered reports of solitary black bears, likely coming from the mountain ranges of northern Mexico. And in the 1980s, visitors from Big Bend National Park began to report sightings more frequently. In 1985, all of the hunting seasons for black bear in Mexico were closed. And 2 years later, Texas followed suit, with the legislation passing a law to aid the species recovery in Texas by recognizing the species as an endangered animal. In 1988, a visitor from Big Bend National Park was actually able to document and photograph a sow with 3 cubs. And this is our first sign that we have a breeding population once again in Texas. The reports of bear sightings continued to increase throughout the late 80s and into the 90s. And it was determined in 1996 that black bear could be downlisted from endangered to threatened in the state of Texas. Texas Parks and Wildlife now tracks our observations through the online black bear database, with our first historical report from Brewster County in 1974. Black bear reports from the 80s and 90s provide a historical reference to the number of sightings each year. But unfortunately, we don't have, or I haven't been able to find the physical copies of these records, so we don't represent all these sightings in our database. They show that in 1987, there was 1 sighting, and in 1989, there was up to 23. And in our database right now, we only have 2 records, and that was from 1987 and 1989. And both were, unfortunately, mortality events. Similar reports from the 90s also list sightings ranging from 84 in 1990 up to 482 sightings in 1994. Now, it's possible that these sightings in our old reports are including sightings from within Big Bend National Park and Guadalupe Mountain National Park. And typically, we don't include these sightings in our black bear database just because of the sheer number of reports the parks have coming in. I do think it's cool to point out that during this time period, there were at least 5 different location events. And among these, there was a sow and her 2 cubs, which had to be translocated from the Del Rio area to Big Bend Ranch State Park. All of them were fitted with ear tags, but the sow was also collared, and she was later tracked into Big Bend National Park, where she continued to live out her life. And 2 years later, there was a tagged bear reported south of Alpine, and it was assumed to be one of her cubs that was released with her in Big Bend Ranch State Park. I also can't continue and leave the 90s without mentioning the most famous bear of them all, El Patron. Bonnie McKinney would be able to do this bear more justice than me, but I will try. The boss was a renegade bear on the run, according to Bonnie. He was known to have destroyed several hunting cabins, and as the story goes, in one incident, he even broke in through an air-conditioned window, ransacked the cabin, and then proceeded to take the mattress, the pillow, and the cover to the screen porch where he spent the night. Now, this led Bonnie to capture, collar, and relocate the bear, but unfortunately, the wayward bear found his way back, and he had to be captured again for a second time. With the second capture, the decision was made to donate him to the Living Desert Zoo in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Well, this infamous bear wasn't done yet. He actually escaped the zoo within a couple hours of arriving and managed to roam around town until he was captured several hours later. This launched a local campaign to raise money to make the enclosure escape-proof for the boss. The local celebrity lived at the zoo until he died in 2004, and it was estimated that his age was over 20 years. Now, starting the new turn of the century, our documented reports continued to grow with 66 total reports coming out of District 1 and 104 for the entire state. It was also during this time that biologists at Black Gap Wildlife Management Area were in full swing with their black bear monitoring project and were tracking at least 7 collared bears. You can check out this video about their work by looking up the YouTube video, Black Bears of Black Gap with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And in 2005, or at some point in the early 2000s, Big Bend National Park reported that all of the bears left for Mexico because of a drought. This event also appears to be reflected at a regional level, as bear sightings in District 1 dropped from 66 in the previous 5 years to only 17 from 2005 to 2009. From 2010 to 2014, our numbers began to look a little better, with a total of 26 sightings being reported from District 1, with all of these being outside of the national park. But it is, however, important to note that in 2011, we also experienced a very severe drought, and that could have impacted the number of bears coming back to the area. From 2015 to 2019, TPWD saw a big rise in the number of reports across the Trans-Pecos, with many more sightings coming in from the Davis Mountains and even lower Presidio County. And in 2017, research efforts at Chinati State Natural Area actually documented the first verified occurrence of black bears within the Chinati Mountains. And the total reports during this time frame raised to 80 within District 1. Since January of last year, we've continued to see a rise in black bear observations, with 62 reports coming in just the past year and a half. And we've had multiple urban interactions that we'll touch on here later. Now, if we map all the reported observations over the last 20 years, we can clearly see that black bear have now occupied most of our western borderlands. Out of the total 479 statewide sightings, District 1 continues to lead as the black bear hotspot with 269 of those observations. However, It is important that we note that not all of these observations are considered Class 1 observations. Well, what does that actually mean? Texas Parks and Wildlife documents sightings as one of 3 different classes, with Class 1 being the most reliable and presenting hard evidence of the observation. Class 2 observations provide a detailed, reliable description, but lack hard evidence, such as a photograph. And Class 3 observations only provide a vague or unreliable information. If we look at all the reported observations versus only the Class 1 observations, and we pay specific attention to the statewide map, we can see that with Class 1 observations, we lack many sightings in the Texas Panhandle, the Texas Hill Country, and even southeastern Texas. Now, this doesn't mean that black bear actually weren't there. It just means we didn't have reliable documentation of those observations to consider them a Class 1 observation. So how does the occupancy at the landscape level compare with what should be expected? Well, in 2009, Rice et al. At Texas Tech University published a habitat suitability model using sightings from 1996 to 2003. They determined that using this model, 25% of the Trans-Pecos contains relatively suitable habitat. If we overlay a subset of our records from the past 20 years, what we see is that their model has pretty accurately depicted the occurrence of black bear on the landscape, with black bear being negatively associated with grasslands and agriculture areas. Fortunately, with the natural expansion into their historic range, it also means that we're going to have more contact with urban areas. This past year, we saw multiple events of black bear entering West Texas towns. Fort Davis, Alpine, and Fort Stockton all had bear reported within the city limits within a single 4-day period. Unfortunately enough, only the Alpine incident required TPWD biologists to respond with hazing practices after the bear decided to take cover under a carport. We were able to successfully deploy hazing practices with the help of Alpine PD, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Game Wardens, and the local sheriff department. The bear quickly left the area and was verified leaving the Alpine area the next morning by hikers on Hancock Hill. A few months later, we received reports and responded to a bear eating pecans off the rooftop in Sanderson, Texas. And after monitoring the situation for the entire day, our district biologist reported that the bear eventually left the area and went on his way. A few weeks later, we unfortunately had a very different event happen in Del Rio, which ended up with a resident shooting and killing a sow and thus orphaning her cub. Now, the cub was transported to a rehab facility in New Mexico, and after gaining all of her much needed winter weight, she has since been released back into Texas on state land. Not only are we going to experience more contact with urban areas, but we also have to realize that more bears also means more unwanted contact with game feeders. So here's a general warning to hunters that you need to be aware of what your target is. Small bears can look very similar to hogs, especially at a quick glance, and it is a violation of the law to kill a black bear in Texas. However, there are ways that hunters can help prevent bear conflict. Hunters should make sure they keep their camps clean to prevent odor attractants. Game should be cleaned in the field and gut piles discarded away from campsites. You should use, or the use of open feeders will likely attract more bears. So thinking about replacing these feeders with automatic spin cast feeders may decrease bear visitation at your feeder sites. And there are also several bait types that you can switch out with corn, one of them being soybeans, to potentially limit bear visitation. Now, Parks and Wildlife has several very helpful resources outlining these guidelines on our bear safety page, and this includes deterring bears with unwelcome mats, a guide to living with bears in Texas, and then also a publication on how to deter bears with electrified fences. Unfortunately, that last publication might not be much help to our West Texas landowners and hunters because of our dry climate. And so for the past year, District 1 staff have been testing methods that can be more effective in our dry West Texas environment. We've tested at least 4 different configurations as of now and have received very informative results, even if they weren't always what we were looking for. To date, we have deployed all hot wires with a buried ground wire. We've tried alternating hot and ground wires. We've deployed electrified hog panel fencing as a grounding agent. And then we've also electrified spin cast feeders with a grounding panel present, and that's what this photo here is of. And all of our fences have been equipped with a warning sign that designate the fence as hot, but that doesn't seem to be a very sufficient deterrent, especially when you're barely literate. So we can't say we didn't warn him. Unfortunately for us, bears are pretty smart, and it doesn't take long for a bear testing an electric fence to come up with some life hacks. In this situation, deploying the idea that as low as you can go means you only touch one wire means this young bear is able to slip right under the bottom wire without receiving a shock. So we had to change our game plan and test a different strategy. Unfortunately, if you're the biggest thing on the landscape, you can always use that to your advantage. Here, a massive male bear comes up to the feeder. And then proceeds to collapse all of our hot and ground wires onto themselves, essentially making our fence ineffective. So back to the drawing board. And that brings us to our latest design, which seems to be one of our most promising. With a hot fence and a ground panel, we are able to see the response that we were hoping for. So by stepping on that panel, there's enough surface contact with the grounding agent that that fence was actually able to deliver the shock. These game cameras have also presented opportunities for us to observe and learn a lot about bear social structure and behavior, and that includes their lack of manners around the dinner table. Bears apparently aren't the sharing kind. Our cameras have also provided us with an opportunity to monitor bear activity throughout the various seasons and observe how bear behavior and activity levels change throughout the year. Now, previous research on black bear behavior and denning practices in northern Mexico and Big Bend National Park have presented different results that have led to more questions about bear denning behavior. Now, I hear a lot of back and forth about whether or not bears in West Texas actually hibernate. And the answer could be both yes and no. Work in northern Mexico suggests that bear activity in the winter may be correlated with reproductive biology, while research conducted by Sul Ross and Big Bend National Park suggests that all bears may reduce activity and are likely to den. Work out of northern New Mexico suggests that pregnant females all den, but may be alert throughout the winter. Denning dates are likely from the end of December all the way through the end of April, and they seem to be independent on what the weather is actually doing. This could be a biological limitation and necessity for pregnant females to den and give birth. With females with yearlings, they seem to remain active throughout the entire winter, but they may den occasionally for shorter periods of time. Results and observations of male and solitary females suggest that they remain active throughout the entire winter, but again may den for short periods of time. Our observations in Terrell County with our game cameras for the past year seem to suggest a similar stance to which Sul Ross reported on in Big Bend National Park, and that is that bear activity slows throughout the fall. Then bears essentially disappear in late December and are not observed again until the spring when they show back up at game feeders. Our game cameras and reports from the public also provide extremely valuable information on where we have established breeding populations in Texas. Reports within the database show that cubs have been documented from Jeff Davis, Presidio, Brewster, Pecos, and Terrell counties within District 1, and even in Crockett and Valverde counties further to the east in District 4. All observations provide a valuable information on the distribution and behavior of black bear in the Trans-Pecos, and Parks and Wildlife would appreciate hearing any and all sightings. But specifically, we have interest in sightings that are either the first in an area, appear to be a bear that has cubs, are happening in or near an urban setting, and of course, any bears with ear tags. We were able, if you can look at the picture behind the text here, redocument a bear that we had tagged in 2017. He was captured in Terligua Ranch, ear tagged, and then transported to Black Gap because of some of the problems he was causing. And then he completely disappeared off our map. It wasn't until last July 2020 that we were able to grab a photograph of him, and he has made it to Big Bend National Park. And having this ear tag information on a translocated bear is very important and provides a lot of information on his movements. Now, if you have a bear sighting and you would like to report it, you can contact your local biologist, and you can find your biologist at TPWD Find a Wildlife Biologist webpage. Please report to either your local biologist or your wildlife diversity biologist or even Jonah, and we can get that information entered into the database. If you happen to have an urban observation, it's very important that you contact your local law enforcement and ask him or her to contact your local game warden and local biologist so that everybody is in the loop, and if necessary, we can respond as fast as possible to the incident. And with that, I would like to provide a special thanks to all of our landowners for providing access for our research, and all members of the public who have reported black bear observations and contributed to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Black Bear Database. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Krista. So we have a couple questions that have come in to the Q&A box, and as a reminder, I believe I've turned off the chat now, but try to enter your question into the Q&A box if you have one, and we will try to get to it. So the first one is from Thomas Yankee. I'm sorry, Thomas, I'm forgetting how to pronounce your last name. What effect does the hot ground panel seem to have on other wildlife activity at the feeders? Does it deter them also? And I think probably the biggest question would be, does it have any sort of deterrent effect on deer who the feeders are designed to be feeding?
Right. The entire time we've been testing these various configurations, we've also been documenting the response to other wildlife, including native deer, aoudad, small mammals. Deer can get shocked. It's less likely with their hooves that they'll make contact with wire paneling. They tend to step in between the squares. But if they do get shocked, it's usually an initial jump, and then they jump over the fence and they continue eating. We haven't seen many instances where a deer receives a shock and it's strong enough that they decide to leave the feeder.
So Cliff Shackelford just had a comment. He said, very good presentation, great images, graphics, and short videos. Enjoyed it very much. Well done. He's also said, P.S. I too am a fan of Veron Bailey's work. He documented one of our state's 3 accepted records of ivory-billed woodpeckers. And for those who don't know, Cliff Shackelford is our state ornithologist. And then Jacob White asked, what does their diet consist of out there other than corn feeders?
Good question.
Hey, that's convenient.
So anything that you would expect an extremely large raccoon to be interested in, you can probably bet on a black bear being interested in. They like to target different opuntia. They also like sotals, bear corn, yuccas make up a large percent of their diet, and of course, any area where they can get acorns, that's a preferred target as well. There are historic reports of black bear in East Texas actually favoring feral hogs as a source of food, which would be great news for our hog control if we could just convince the black bear to take that up in West Texas.
Lucy Spade asked, what type of hazing do you use? Beanbags, question mark?
Yes, in that particular situation in Alpine, we were able to work with the game wardens and the sheriff's department, and we deployed beanbags as an incentive to get the bear to go ahead and move out. We also backed that up with loud noises, yelling, shouting, and we deployed essentially a firecracker round that goes up in the air and explodes and creates a loud booming noise. And as soon as that happened, that bear was out of there.
And Donna Cole asked, how can we tell if 2 or more bears are a sow with cubs? We do have game camera photos from feeder in Terrell County. Also, our very awesome game wardens may not be aware that biologists are still looking for sightings.
A sow with cubs at this time of year, if this is the first year cubs, they are going to be extremely small, like small dog, house cat size right now. If they're second year cubs and they're still with mom, there's still going to be a noticeable size difference between mom and these cubs. Based off of the behavior that we saw around feeders, I wouldn't expect multiple bears who weren't related to be hanging out at a feeder with each other and behaving cordially. If there are multiple bears at the feeder and they're not related or they're older siblings, they're going to tend to want to fight and push the other bear away from the feeder.
Dennis Foley asked, is there a breeding population in the Chisos Mountains, or are they all migratory bears?
The Chisos Mountains have our largest known breeding population. Raymond Skiles estimates that there's at least 3 dozen black bear in the Chisos Mountains, or at least in the national park itself. We do have records of cubs from all of the counties that are highlighted in yellow right now, but they are less frequently reported than the cubs we see in the Chisos Mountains.
And Paul White asks, how big would that bear that collapsed the fence have been? It looked huge. And is there any similar work being done on bear in the Texas Panhandle?
The Panhandle question would be a Russell question. I don't know if Russell's on right now. I think they receive less frequent observations than we do, so they might not have the opportunities to deploy a similar research project like we are. The bear in the video is huge. And I'm not even gonna try and lie to you on what I think he could weigh.
You know, Krista, when I was out in Alpine, a bear was killed by a car on the highway near Alpine, and I think it was maybe the largest bear that had been picked up in a long time, and I think it was 416 pounds, and that's the one that's in the Museum of the Big Bend now. So I don't know how big this one is, but that seems to be about the biggest that we've seen out in that country in a long time. Is that 400 something pound bear. Oh, and Krista,
Yeah.
I think it's probably fine for you to turn your video back on if you want to for these Q&A. I meant to mention that at the beginning and forgot.
I can't seem to find my WebEx.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Then Austin Stolte asked, in your research, did you find any evidence of black bears using mesquite beans as a seasonal food source?
Austin, I haven't done a black bear diet analysis. I don't remember what that last slide said, if mesquite beans were on there or not. But I'm assuming based off of the other mammals that are attracted to mesquite beans, I'm assuming bears would love them.
Yeah, I think
I don't know
they'll
if
eat.
this is the same bear or a different bear, but this bear is also very hefty.
Yeah, yeah, corn-fed bears right there. Dustin McBride asks, what are the current and future management and research goals, objectives, priorities for black bears in West Texas and the rest of Texas?
Right now, we want to make sure that we're able to document accurately where we have breeding populations of bear in Texas. That's going to help us know where we have strong resident populations year after year. After that, I'd like to pursue as much genetic work as we can, looking at bears in northern Mexico, bears in New Mexico, and then the bears that we have here in the Trans-Pecos. The previous editions of the Mammals of Texas suggest that most of the bear found in West Texas are actually the subspecies from New Mexico. Based off of what we've seen with bear recolonizing the Trans-Pecos, I don't know if that's any longer the case. I'm assuming that most of our bear in the Trans-Pecos now are actually the Mexico subspecies coming north. So a lot of genetic work. We can continue looking at diet for bear in the Trans-Pecos, and then making sure that we have accurate population estimates and know where our breeding populations are is where we want to go in the future.
And Dustin, from the statewide perspective, we've been working on a black bear management plan for some time, and there's 6 different goals and then nested objectives sort of underneath each one. And you know, the goals are A is minimize frequency of human bear conflicts, and that's really our number one priority in a lot of ways because there's historically bears were all throughout Texas. The habitat hasn't changed dramatically in many cases. Really, what I think we've recognized is that all across the United States, whether it's Aspen, Colorado, or Townsend, Tennessee, or places in New Jersey, there's lots and lots of places where towns have learned how to coexist really well with bears, and it takes a little bit of a learning curve and learning how to keep the attractants secured. And so that's number one, is minimizing human bear conflicts and then improving those outcomes however we can. And we have a number of other goals and objectives, but we're working on that, and hopefully it'll be the final version will be released fairly soon. Arlene Kalmbach asks, says this is Henry Kalmbach. I'm 9. I'm wondering which county in Texas are bears most recorded in. That's got to be Brewster, right, Krista?
Yeah, I would say Brewster, but Terrell's hitting back pretty hard. We like our game feeders out in Terrell County, and so do the bears.
Cool. Good to have a 9-year-old here, Henry. And then Ryan McGillicuddy said, the current slide answers my question fairly well. If there are any other questions you would like to prioritize. Did I miss his previous question? Did we get to it? No, we got it. Okay. Marilyn McFarland asked, how aggressive are black bears as opposed to grizzlies?
In
Krista,
relation to humans, what is she asking?
Well, I could just say that the first question I would answer is related to humans, and that there was a research project a few years ago that looked at confirmed attacks by black bears on people in the United States, and found that there was 14 confirmed fatal attacks on people by black bears in the lower 48 states in like the last 100 years or so. You know, they're considering how close black bears coexist with people. Fatal attacks are extremely rare. There's probably 10 to 20 fatal attacks on people every year by domestic dogs, and there's been 14 by bears in the last 100 years. You should still take precautions in bear country, but if that's the question, then that's how I would approach answering it. And yeah, grizzly bears would be much more dangerous. If you're in grizzly country, you definitely equip differently than if you're in black bear country. And Krista, the video you're showing is about is maybe is answering her question more. Maybe it's about okay, so she actually followed up. She said the nature of black bears in relation to humans. But your video is definitely showing that black bears can be quite aggressive with each other at times.
Yeah, and especially during mating season, the wounds that we see on these male bears can be pretty extensive. And, you know, that's a bear afflicting a wound on another male bear.
So we have a few more minutes and we're getting close to the end of the questions here, but Adam asked, he says, I see clear evidence of persimmon being a focus of food choice from August through November. So I guess it's not a question, but more of a, you know, he's saying that he's seen them eating persimmon. I have no doubt that they would. Every other omnivorous carnivore. I know that sounds like a contradictory statement, but it's not. Also eats persimmon, like foxes and coyotes and raccoons and stuff. Thomas had another question. Do you have any resources or telltale signs to verify or nullify if bears may be preying or scavenging on located animal carcasses? Also, are there other ways to verify bear sign, tracks, foraging methods without actually seeing a bear on your property?
As far as being a scavenger, Sol Ross and BRI have done a lot of work staking out carcasses for mountain lion research, and we've asked if they can provide any data of black bear actually coming to those staked out carcasses and utilizing that as a food source. I'm gonna suggest that if there's any type of carcass on the landscape, a black bear is gonna take full advantage of that and utilize that food source, especially the closer they get to winter and needing to put on that type of fat reserve. And the second question was, how can you tell if there's bear without tracks?
Yeah, looking at tracks and sign kind of stuff. Other evidence of bear activity.
I've seen, especially in Terrell County, a lot of bear rubs on tall yucca plants and different things where they just completely annihilate the plant. Like it almost looks like it got struck by lightning or somebody sat there and used it as a punching bag. I don't know if they're sharpening claws or what they're doing, but they're pulling at some of these plants and just disintegrating the plant. It's kind of interesting when you find one of those.
That's cool. I don't know that I've seen that sign. Some other things that people look for is like their scent marking trees where they rub their back and then oftentimes they twist their head and bite the tree. And so you'll get these bite marks at about the height of the bear and rubs, and oftentimes there'll be sap dripping on the tree and you'll find bear hair. Um, and then sometimes you'll find, like if you can't find tracks, like if you're in a place with a lot of leaf litter and stuff, you'll find what we call ritual trails, where all the bears, it's a scent marking behavior where they walk very intentionally. They set their foot down and kind of twist it as they walk, and it kind of gets that scent coming out of their scent glands. And they will literally walk in each other's footprints over and over and over again. So you'll find these kind of trails of, sometimes people call them bear stairs, that look like these little stair step things. They're kind of cool. And then scat,
Yeah.
right? Bear scat.
As we get here close to the end, I just want to throw out that if you've got any type of game camera photographs or you've had any observations in black bears where you've taken pictures, please send that to us if you think it's information that we don't have. All information is information, even if the bear has been documented at the site before. Knowing the time of year that the bear's there is also extremely valuable. If the bear's seen in the wintertime, we would really like to know what their winter activity levels are. So anything from late December to early March would be very beneficial. Yeah, so don't feel like you're annoying us just by sending us photos. We're happy to receive all of that and put that information in our database.
We had a couple more questions. Johnny Arredondo asked, do you have evidence or reports from landowners, ranchers about black bear preying on livestock? If so, what's that number?
Going through the historical reports from the 70s and 80s, there was evidence in the past that in some situations, black bear did predate livestock. There was a potential case here recently of a possible black bear depredation. It wasn't, however, or we weren't, however, able to confirm that the bear was what killed the livestock. It could have been that the bear was taking advantage of another predator kill and just scavenging the carcass. Something to look for in those situations is if the animal appears to have been stripped, like you're pulling a shirt off something, the bear's going to try and pull that skin off like he's essentially pulling the shirt off of the lamb or the goat or whatever we're talking about. That's a sign of a potential bear kill or a potential bear scavenge. And that's something that you should notify your local biologist about so we can come out and investigate any possible depredation.
And then I apologize if I mispronounce it. Mary Hanley, I believe it's Mary, M-A-R-I. How do you predict the population to change with climate change and increased drought predictions in Texas? And Krista, the one thing I would say is that in 2011, when we had the drought and food resources dried up, bears hit the trail and we had dispersal all over the place. But I don't know. I'll let you answer the rest of that question.
Yeah, I don't see drought being an extreme driving factor based off of the number of artificial food sources, especially corn feeders across the entire Trans-Pecos, and then further into the Texas Hill Country. As long as we're putting food out on the landscape, the bears are going to seek out and utilize those food sources. And like Jonah mentioned, if we do experience extreme drought situation like we are here in West Texas right now, these bears are likely to disperse both more northward and more eastward. So we could see more bears popping up in the Texas Hill Country, and even further than just the Hill Country.